Hello, everyone, and welcome to another webisode of All Politics Are Local. I'm WSAV.com now reporter John Dowding. Every week, we take the time to break down some of those big headlines coming out of Washington, D.C., as well as Atlanta, to see how they're impacting us right here in the Coastal Empire and Low Country. Right now, we're being joined by WSAV Washington correspondent Kelly Meyer. Hey, Kelly, how are you doing?
Hey, John, I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So, you were busy last week. We caught up with you last week, literally while you were on the Hill, preparing for the services in the Capitol for Representative John Lewis. And obviously now you're back at home, working from home, covering, honestly, I think what the biggest thing we're kind of hoping for to come out of Washington this week, which is another COVID relief bill. But, really quickly, just, tell us about John Lewis's, when he was lying in state in the Capitol. It definitely was probably a moving, moment to witness history like that, and to see the greatness of somebody, and so many people coming out to respect and show their appreciation for him. So how was it covering that?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. It really was such a memorable moment personally to cover something like this. It was my first coverage of a Lion State, which is such a historic and just a tradition that has been going on for so long. And to see this for Congressman Lewis, he was the first Black lawmaker to lie in state. Obviously, his history of civil rights, he's an icon fighting for racial equality. And seeing the people that came out, for me, it really stood out the members that came out to visit him from Congress, but also the people who stopped by from all across Washington, Virginia, and Maryland, and a lot of kids. I think that's what stood out the most, is the number of children that came by to see him, which we know is what he talked about the most, really, was his pushing it on to the next generation and how the next generation can pick up with the fight and the movement, as he called it. So it was a really beautiful moment and great to talk to people about why they wanted to be out there. So I appreciate you all watching the stories and checking it out, and it was just a really memorable week.
You had a long day there, covering from beginning to end, and we're going to catch up later on in the episode with Arshish Seshadri, who covered some of the services that happened in Atlanta last week, which were also broadcast on WSAV and some of the other networks as well. But thank you for sharing that, Kelly. And switching gears here, talking about, we were talking about this right before we came on. We've been talking for weeks about another set of relief for families during COVID-19, another set of possible stimulus checks. Kelly, I guess the biggest question that I'm wondering, or families at home are wondering, how possible is it for congressional leaders to come together and not only pass another bill, but pass this bill before their August recess? I mean, obviously, we're in August, but their recess would probably start by the end of this week. So, Kelly, what are the chances of something getting passed, and what are our local lawmakers saying about it in D.C.?
Well, as we employment benefit fund ran out Friday, so they're already working beyond this deadline, trying to get a deal reached when this has already run out. So you have seen members from the White House coming up to Capitol Hill throughout the weekend and trying to negotiate a deal, like you were saying, with Speaker Pelosi, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. We've seen Treasury Secretary Mnuchin up there, as well as Mark Meadows, the Chief of Staff to President Trump. And they're really not getting anywhere with this negotiation process. The Democrats are staying firm on their bill. They say they want state and local funding. They say they want that $600 unemployment benefit to stay. Republicans want some, kind of like lessening on this, really. They want to see a lowering of the amount for both the unemployment benefit. They are not really coming across the table on state and local funding. So they're really at this stalemate. And like we were talking about a bit before we came on here, Democrats are kind of leaning into the fact that we have an election year coming up and hoping that some of the more vulnerable senators come over to agree with them. So they are kind of holding firm on this position. So the answer to your question is we really don't know if there's going to be a deal. Sometimes in this process, you see some inkling that there is progress, and we are not seeing that right now. So it really is anyone's guess. You might see them staying into August further, canceling a bit of their recess, maybe entirely, maybe just a little bit, but they have to get something worked out before they go home.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's clear that they have to get something done before they go home. I think, like you said, making a really good point about this being an election year, especially for a number of senators. Honestly, I think a lot of senators are in some not weak positions, but I think a lot of the country in some areas is kind of flipping. There's the potential for some red states to turn blue, some blue states to turn red, so a lot of senators have a lot to lose. And I think right now when, people's pockets are hurting the most during this time period, that's obviously something that people are going to want the relief for. And that's why they need to work through something. Kelly, I know you spoke with Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, as well as Senator Doug, God, his name is escaping me, Doug Jones.
Yes, you got it.
My brain is all over the place. Can you tell?
Okay.
I'm just happy I got dressed and actually look okay this morning. But yeah, so you spoke to Senators Lindsey Graham and Senator Doug Jones about, some of the progress. And you kind of got somebody, talked to a Republican senator and a Democratic senator about, what the two different parties are trying to get in this latest relief bill. So Kelly, talk us through about, what they were telling you about it and what they're hoping to see in this bill.
For those two senators, what is a really big sticking point is the education funding. So they're looking at just over $100 billion for education funding, and that's resources for schools who want to go back this year. That's resources for schools who want to do virtual learning. They both were very much for that. But where they differed is, should the kids go back to school? Lindsey Graham believes that kids should be in the classroom. He believes that kids are immune to getting this virus. He had said, Bill Gates had just said last week that kids are immune. And in my story from Friday, we obviously had heard from Dr. Fauci, Dr. Redfield, who said kids are not immune. And I think everyone wants to see kids back in the classroom, but whether it can be done safely. And that's where Alabama Senator Doug Jones, a Democrat from Alabama, is saying, we have to figure out how we could do this safely, because teachers we're talking with in Alabama don't want to get back into the classroom in person. So they're really divided on that. And that's a really big talking point here on Capitol Hill, and what you'll see going into this next coronavirus relief package. So let's take a listen to what both Republican Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina and Democrat from Alabama, Senator Doug Jones, had to say about returning back to school this fall.
Not going to school has a downside. Bill Gates said today that children do not transmit the virus like adults.
We got schools in Alabama that are set to open next week.
I kind of did a story more locally here where I spoke to some private schools. I spoke to two different private schools here in the Savannah area and just kind of talked to them about, what are they doing to prepare? Obviously being a private school, they don't have to follow, national, state guidelines. And a lot of them, what they actually ended up doing, it's almost like what we're seeing as the national response was. They put together task forces created by staff members and parents and healthcare professionals, figure out what works best for their students for both of this. And it was really interesting because, they're both located here in Savannah. They're both, have the similar age groups. They have from K through 12. They have, closed campuses, it's a smaller sort of campus, but, one school is requiring face masks for students while they're indoors, and the other building, the other school isn't. So I think it's really interesting to see the divide amongst not just public and private schools, and not just sending people back to school, sending students back to school, but seeing what different places are doing to get school going, to get school up and running. And I think that, in the coming weeks, we're obviously going to see more and more divides amongst that as back to school kind of starts ramping up a little bit more. But Kelly, I think one other thing before we go, I wanted to ask you about was touching up on the bill, the GOP bill that was, put together with the White House. There was reports from, and I saw something from a Republican senator from Louisiana, John Kennedy. He was basically saying that there's so much in the bill that doesn't have to do with COVID-19. I think there was something for defense spending in there as well. So, Kelly, what are some of those hiccups that are also holding senators back because they're trying to pass something about COVID-19, and there's other things in there that don't have to do with COVID-19. Just really quickly wanted to, mention that.
Yeah, and it's an age-old tactic of Capitol Hill lawmakers to kind of sneak in some of their wish list into a bill that's being worked on in a larger package. You always see that happening when we're doing different bills. They're trying to sneak something in on their agenda that they promised maybe their constituents they would get in. And that is a great point, though, because what they may be sneaking in there may be something that Democrats are going to say, hey, that won't fly. You can't get that in there. Sometimes it's caught and they catch it before it's passed, and sometimes it's not. That's why you see some of these things go through. And sometimes there are things that say, okay, you know what, if we get this bigger package through, we'll let you have that. So it really is this give and take negotiating process. But as we said earlier, it really is stuck up here and it really isn't getting anywhere. So we got to see more of that give and take. You're going to see these lawmakers up here again today just to preview what's happening. You're going to see Mnuchin and Meadows come back to the Hill today. The Senate Republican Conference has this big lunch on Tuesday, so you may see something come out of that. So keep an eye out for that. But negotiations are very much continuing today. So the best advice is keep an eye on those this week, and hopefully we will see a bill out there for the American people, because we know everyone needs some more relief during this.
Yeah, let's definitely hope that we can see something come out of all of these negotiations that seem to be going on for, weeks now. But thank you, as always, Kelly, for being our eyes and ears on Capitol Hill and, keeping an eye out for everything going on.
Always. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you so much, Kelly. And right now we're being joined by WSAV Atlanta Bureau Chief Archit Seshadri, who's joining us from Atlanta, of course. Hey, Archit, how are you doing?
Hey, doing well. It's a new month, right? So let's see what stories we're going to be exploring this month.
Yep, new month. We already had a tropical storm pass through, and I'm sure we're going to see even more stuff coming out of the Capitol as COVID still, rages across the state. But, before we get started, obviously talking about the never-ending cycle of COVID-19 stories, I wanted to ask you about, your coverage last week of John Lewis's funeral processions and the different celebrations that were going on in Atlanta. Obviously, he was he laid in state in the Capitol, and then they brought him to Atlanta. We had that service with President Obama, President Clinton, President Bush, a number of other people who were also in attendance, and different processions that went on in the city. You covered it for us here for all of Nexstar in Georgia and South Carolina and Florida. So tell us, Archit, what was that experience like? That was a historic moment to see people coming out for such a strong, influential figure. So what was it like?
Especially in the middle of a pandemic, the fact that we're in the middle of a global health crisis, and to see the number of people that showed up. It was on Wednesday. Wednesday was when his casket arrived to the state capitol, where people could say that one final goodbye. Those lines were extended along throughout the Capitol in downtown. So they extended the hours till about 10 o'clock at night. And, it was scorching hot, it was blazing, and that didn't stop people. So from 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when we got there, we saw Atlanta's mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms, Georgia's governor, pay some tribute and honor and respect his family, the legacy that he leaves behind. We saw people just trickle in. This was after a 6-day tour. So he was in Alabama, in Washington, D.C., and then Atlanta was his final resting place. So that went on, lots of speeches, lots of people singing songs of prayer. And he also represented Georgia's 5th congressional district, which covers part of Atlanta and the airport. So a huge part of that, playing an instrumental role in politics as well for more than 3 decades, serving on city council and on the congressional district, the U.S. House of Representatives. So there will now be a special election. The governor's called for that September 29th to fill his vacancy. But yes, certainly emotional, certainly, people were comparing him to Martin Luther King Jr., saying we've lost another good one. And some of the people I interviewed, one of them had a free-ish t-shirt, a very interesting spin off the TV show Blackish, saying that we're free, but not fully. And we have a long way to still go to continue the legacy that he left, doing those peaceful protests, sit-ins, and things to get an equal America for everyone.
I was watching during the day the coverage we had on WSAV, which was, the NBC, which was NBC's coverage of it. And it definitely was a somber event. And it was great to just see the country be able to come together to recognize in such horrible times, to be able to come together to recognize and acknowledge somebody who did so much for so many people. But I mean, we could talk about him forever. So we got to switch gears here though, because right now we're in back to school season. Obviously there's no doubt August, that's when you start going to Staples, you start going to Target, you start buying all the things your kids need for school. Obviously, as with everything going on in the world, it is being derailed, and there's a lot of challenges because of our new normal in the pandemic. So, Archith, let me ask you this: what are officials in Atlanta, statewide officials, saying about going back to school here in Georgia? I mean, the Peach State has been seeing an increase in cases recently, and we're just kind of following those trends from Florida and Texas and other states in the South along the Sun Belt.
Right.
So, what are some of our officials saying out there in Atlanta about going back to school?
Yeah, John, it's so hard to believe that we're already back to school. I mean, we're past that 5-month mark when most of the kids were pulled back from school because of the pandemic back in March, and now here we are in August. We spoke to health officials and doctors both at Augusta University and Emory, and a lot of them are sort of coming to that conclusion. The American Association of Pediatrics says it is important for kids to be in school. Yes, we're in the middle of a pandemic, but they say that the emotional, the behavioral, the social learning skills that they will get in person just simply cannot be replicated when it's virtual. So they are pushing for kids to go back to the classroom with, of course, those proper measures of wearing masks and cleaning and spacing out the cafeteria. And the CDC also released new guidelines and data saying that age group is very, very, very small risk for contracting the virus. In fact, 7% of kids have contracted COVID-19 according to the CDC, and 1% has died. So in the grand scheme of things, they say it's a very small, minuscule chance. In fact, the teachers are the ones that are more at risk than the students. But I think a lot of schools are not coming up with new ways and plans, staggering schedules, offering the in-person versus virtual learning options. And 10 to 17, that's the age group that's more at risk than the younger students. So elementary kids are safer, and middle school and high school a little bit more at risk. But most of the doctors, we say, you know what, you got to get kids back in classroom so we can start this process and get them back into a normal sense, because there's some things that you just can't sit at home learn. You can't do that. And even with sports, we spoke to some sports doctors who say that if your kids are in high school, looking at high school sports, or in college, there are certain sports that work better: tennis, golf, flag football, things like that. Outdoors, less folks, less contact, as opposed to football and basketball and volleyball, maybe more popular, but certainly more dangerous for contracting the virus.
There's definitely more of a risk with those high contact sports that you're talking about there. And I mean, something I was talking with Kelly about was talking to some private schools here. I spoke to some private schools here in Savannah, and it seems like what a lot of the schools, private, public, what they're all seeming to do with those higher risk age groups is have, instead of the students rotate around, they're having the teachers rotate around. So instead of having these huge groups of students go from room to room to room to room, they're just having the teachers do that to kind of minimize any sort of greater transmission. But one of the big questions I have is we're not really seeing any national guidelines, any federal guidelines coming from the White House, coming from the Trump administration about going back to school, saying you have to follow X, Y, and Z guidelines. Are we seeing that here in Georgia? Are we seeing any statewide officials saying you must do X, Y, and Z in order to open up schools?
I think the school superintendent has sort of left it to the respective school districts. For example, last week, Jefferson City School, it's about 1.5 hours northeast of Atlanta, they have gone back, one of the first districts to go back. Last week, there was teacher planning for Gwinnett County. Gwinnett is the largest school district in the state of Georgia. They, in fact, had 260 employees who tested positive. So now, as some of these teachers or staff are going back, you're also dealing with this sort of unprecedented situation. Well, what happens if a staff member gets sick or a large group of teachers get sick? What do you do then? Do you just send them back home and go back to virtual? So a lot of parents that I've spoken to say they are not ready to send their kids back to school. Same with teachers, but they are finding ways to maybe adjust with that and on a case by case. There are some school districts like Atlanta Fulton, which is very large, Cobb County. When at the larger, more where you have a lot more student population, they're a little bit more concerned than some of your outlier small town communities where you have that flexibility of maybe not as many kids in the classroom. And as you pointed out, teachers perhaps rotating. The big question is, how do you socially distance in a classroom? There's really no way. It's very tough to make a kid wear a mask for 6-7 hours at a stretch. I went to yoga, just to digress, yesterday for an hour. I did it. I finally went back. An hour is doable. It's tough, but you're sweating. Think about a kid. There are already so many distractions. They got the phones, they're learning, their summer break. They want to meet and interact. And then now on top of that, you want them to wear a mask. Yes, I understand that we need to do that, but realistically, is that feasible? We'll have to see how teachers will be able to persuade kids to do that, or if that's even possible.
And I think that's a great point, especially with, and this is something else I spoke to some school officials about too here, was the differences in care and, spacing, sanitation based on age level. With younger kids, that kindergarten, first, second, third, that age group is like you're at a touchy-feely age. You want to touch things, you want to touch other people, all that kind of stuff. When you get to middle school and high school, it's a little bit easier to be able to separate people and a little bit easier to have better sanitation and stuff like that.
Right.
The younger age group presents some challenges. So I think it's really interesting that, here in Savannah, the public school system, I think they are starting out the school year virtual, because it is one of those large public school systems in the state, like you just said, with Atlanta Fulton. So otherwise, though, what have been some of the trends we're seeing, switching from, talking about schools and sports during COVID, specifically just to the pandemic itself? Right before we go, let's just touch on this. What are we seeing here as far as the pandemic in Georgia? Are we seeing cases continue to increase at an exponential rate? Are we starting to see a plateau? What are some of the health officials saying?
Yeah, those numbers, we wish they were going down more and more. We've seen a couple of record highs, I think 4,000 to 5,000 cases on Sundays. I think now it'll be interesting, as we pointed out, with kids going back to school, how that perhaps could change that. We don't know just yet, because not all kids are going back. They do have the option of being virtual. For the most part, though, for example, tying it all back together, last week when we were covering John Lewis's funeral, when we've been out and about, a lot of people are wearing the mask. That's a great thing. We are seeing people going out and about, but doing that. Could they be doing a better job of social distancing? Absolutely. But that's only possible in certain types of areas, outdoors and parks. At a restaurant, you got to eat or you have to drink. You don't have to, but how are you going to wear a mask? It's pretty tough to do that. So I think it's on a case-by-case basis. But going back to school situation, I saw that some schools are even looking at staggering cafeteria schedules and lunch and recess breaks. So it's not only going to be a new experience for students, but the staff as well. You think about those crowded cafeteria tables or getting your food. And one of the reasons that a lot of advocates are pushing for kids to go back to school is the nutritional learning. Some families simply cannot afford to have their kids those meals, and sometimes going to school through SNAP programs and other things like that. That is a benefit that you're getting by giving those kids not only education and social learning, but also the nutrition that they need. So, it's hard, it's a hard 50-50 toss-up to say what works and what doesn't. But one thing that is for sure, this is going to be a school year that very different than all the other ones, and even testing, standardized testing, SATs, college exams, all of that is changing, even APs. Could that be a thing of the past, or could that completely change? We'll find out in the months ahead.
Yeah, I hate to say it, and I hope I don't sound ridiculous, but it's life under the new normal. Thank you so much.
Normal.
It's the new normal. What are we going to do? Thank you so much.
When is it going to be just the normal? It's always the new normal. When are we just going to be normal? I don't know.
Honestly, I wish we could have the answer for that. Thank you so much, Archith, for joining, for keeping us updated with everything going on. We'll see you again next week. And as always, you can see more of Archith's stories on our website, as well as Kelly's stories on our website. You can just go to wsav.com/Washington. You can catch up on previous episodes of All Politics Are Local as well right now on our website. Just go to wsav.com/All Politics Are Local. Thank you so much for watching. Again, I'm John Dowding. We'll see you again next week on All Politics Are Local.